Hello and welcome to episode 25 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning speaking to you as always from my house here in southeast London. Hope you enjoyed the last podcast if you took the time to listen to it with Peter McDonald, director, second unit director, cinematographer, camera operator and also director in his own right. I really enjoyed chatting to Peter about his many and varied stories in the film industry. I really do enjoy speaking to people who are at that stage in their life where their career is kind of over, they've retired, and they don't have to bullshit about the industry they worked in. Peter kind of tells it how it is, without, being mean, but just being truthful. I kind of get the feeling that he would have spoken like that if I'd interviewed him at any point in his career, though. So for this episode, the first episode of May 2021, there will be another one. I'm very pleased to say I have film journalist and author Helen O'Hara. Helen recently released a book that she's written called Women versus Hollywood, The Fall and Rise of Women in Film. Fall first and then rise again, because women were very prevalent in early filmmaking and then kind of disappeared. And Helen has put together this wonderful book that describes what happened there and how we're hopefully getting back to a position where women are involved more in the movie making industry, because I think we've missed out on so many potentially great films that could have been helmed by women, written by women, and having more women involved. So I'm recording this here just at the end of April 2021, and just last night Chloe Zhao won Best Picture at the Oscars for Nomadland, and it's amazing to think that she's only the second woman in Oscar history to win the Best Picture award, and also the first woman of colour. It just boggles my mind. As somebody who grew up here in southeast London and has lived the majority of their life here, a very diverse community that I live in, it just boggles the mind that it's taken that long for Hollywood to even, not even catch up, to even start to be thinking about understanding the importance of more diversity in their industry. We all look up to Hollywood in a way. There's not a great deal to look up to when you think about it, but hopefully that's changing. And Helen's book is hopefully part of that. I've read it a couple of times now. I've also listened to the Audible version. I've bought copies for my mother-in-law and for my sister as well. My kids have been taking interest in me reading it. I was very grateful for Helen giving her time this morning, the morning after the Oscars. So here's my chat with Helen O'Hara, author of Women versus Hollywood, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So how did you start your career as a film journalist, Helen? What was your road to that moment?
I don't know if there is a conventional road, but I don't think mine was. So I trained as a barrister and literally just qualified, and then I'd be how to put this? I'd been bored out of my mind for years, but I kept giving law a chance because I was quite a sensible young person, and I thought it would be good to be, financially secure and so on. And then I obviously got less sensible because I just kept hating it, and eventually got to a point where I would every year I'd be like, well, if I get into law school, I'll go. Well, if I get pupillage, I'll do it. And then after pupillage, I said, well, if I get tenancy, which is kind of a job, that's basically a job. It's not quite, but it kind of is. Then I'll do that. And then I'll do that for a couple of years and save up. And then I'll jump and try and do something else with my life. And I didn't get tenancy where I was. And thank God, because I don't think I ever could have turned my back on the money if I had actually gotten going as a barrister. So I was used to being penniless, which came in as great training for being a journalist. And I was very, very lucky. A couple of months later, and I'd been kind of working in the meantime just for a charity, but a couple of months later, a job came up at Empire, an internship on the website. And I went for that. I was the compromise candidate. I've said this before. I was not the first choice candidate, but I ended up getting the job anyway and made myself useful enough that after the 3-month internship, they asked me to stay another 3 and then another 4. And then they offered me a place on a 6-month training scheme. And then I had another 6 months probation. And so after 22 months, I finally got an actual staff job, and I stayed there in total for just under 11 years and then went freelance. So I'm now freelance, but also editor at large. So I have that tie back to the mothership.
And what does an internship involve then in a magazine like Empire?
Well, it was pretty great at that point. Now, we don't have quite the same thing anymore just because the office is tiny and obviously at the moment the office is virtual. But the basic thing in those days was I was doing a lot of transcribing of interviews, editing of transcripts so we could put up something that actually read well. I would go out and cover the premieres, which sounds glamorous, but absolutely wasn't. It usually meant that you stood freezing on a red carpet for 3 or 4 hours and didn't get to see the film, and certainly didn't get asked to the premiere party or anything exciting like that. So, but still, good training, helped me out. And then I would also do things like, sending out competition prizes and making tea and, kind of dog spotty stuff that you do when you're kind of starting out.
And was there a definite ladder ahead of you then? Was there one that you could see that you would be able to climb to a sort of higher point?
There was at least the suggestion of a ladder. It wasn't terribly clear. But yeah, I kind of figured, at least I was in a good place to be starting off. I was obviously very lucky to get into Empire. And I kind of felt like if I've done my 3 months or then my 6 months here, that's something that I can build on. That's something I can take to other places. And I think at that point in the early noughties, it did feel like there was at least the possibility of other, entry-level jobs in journalism if I didn't get this one. So I don't know if it's quite so easy now for young people. I do try to be... I try to be optimistic. I don't want to put anybody off, but at the same time, I try to be guardedly optimistic, I think, for a lot of young people coming into the profession now, because I think it's gotten more difficult, for sure.
And that would have been fairly male-dominated at the time, wouldn't it? Empire. Yeah. I must admit, I haven't bought Empire for years. I used to buy it when I worked in London, and went through Victoria Station every week or every month, and would pick up the magazine. And it was a very sort of male-dominated publication. Like, you look at like the top 100s, and you'd scroll quite some way to find even a picture of a woman in a film, let alone a woman about.
I mean, I think some of that is, like, not on us. Some of that is the movie industry. If you look at the number of female directors, you look at the number of female leads in the top grossing films of the year, it's not a majority. But it was a male dominated space at the time. I think I was lucky that the then editor of the website was a woman called Catherine, who was brilliant. So she obviously didn't have any of those kind of, she wasn't inclined particularly to hire men or women. She was kind of, there were no sort of unconscious biases there, I don't think. And going in, when I sort of, we became a bit more integrated into the magazine, it was definitely male dominated. I was the only female writer on staff my whole time there. There were obviously the production manager is a woman. She's fantastic and a very good writer, but that's not her primary role. Picture editor was a woman. But really, I did tend to be sort of the lone voice, at least in the office. We obviously had great female freelancers as well, like Anna Smith and Angie Errigo. But really, it was until Terry came in, 2015. And look, I've spoken about Terry before, and it's probably gushingly, embarrassingly. And I know she's my boss, but honestly, it's genuine. She is phenomenal. She came in like just this breath of fresh air and just swept through the place. And just, not only is she kind of obviously open to covering everybody, and she wants Empire to be a very broad church, and she wants to make sure we talk about the small independent films as well as the big blockbusters. She's very focused on that, which, editors before her have been, but maybe to a slightly sometimes less effective extent. But she's also just incredibly forensic about the language that we use, the way we talk about things. She will absolutely come down like a ton of bricks on people using any language that might be offensive or exclusionary. And just kind of, I think that sort of change of mentality really has really, really massively helped the magazine. I mean, obviously the covers are the covers, and it's going to be the big films, and those are still male dominated. But the content, I think, has really, really changed as a result.
Oh, good. I'll definitely revisit.
Yeah, you should.
It'll be
honestly
interesting to see the change. It has been a long time. It really has been. It's been a long time since I've bought a magazine. Let alone
I know
Empire.
it's a terrible thing.
Yeah, although my house is a lot clearer now. I used to have piles of these movie
It's very hard to
magazines.
let them go.
Yeah, that's it. I also, of course, want to talk to you about your fantastic book, Women versus Hollywood: The Fall and Rise of Women in Film. Can you sort of pinpoint where that idea began to gestate and develop?
Yeah, so I mean, it's something I've been writing about and talking about for a while in, little fits and starts. It helped that there was an online magazine for a while called The Pool, which I wrote for a lot, and they were female focused and very feminist. And basically everything I wrote for them was in some way kind of connected to this question of why aren't there more women in Hollywood? Why are the women that there are, the actresses and the stars and the directors, not getting the same opportunities maybe as their male counterparts? So that it's been something that's been on my mind, but it really came about because I discovered that a film journalist friend of mine was actually only a film journalist by night and was a book publisher by day. And I basically said to her, can we sit down and talk sometime? Because I'd written 2 previous books and I just wanted to ask about publishing essentially and say sort of, is this normal? Like they were published with basically 0 fanfare, which is fine. I didn't expect them to be, book of the year or anything. But like, I was like, my publisher didn't even email me when they were coming out. And I was a bit like, is that kind of normal? Is that how publishing works? So anyway, so I kind of said we should get together and have a coffee. And then she sent me this email going, come in for coffee. We might be able to work together. And I hadn't considered that at all. It wasn't it genuinely wasn't a sort of work thing that I had in mind. I just wanted to understand a bit more about the industry. And so I thought, okay, well, I better go in with some ideas. And basically this is what I pitched that day. It's obviously been, refined and expanded a bit. But really it was just about why are we where we are? Why is the situation the way it is? Because I knew there had been women there in the silent era at the very dawn of filmmaking. So why did they get pushed out and the men took over? And I kind of had an idea. And, I kind of thought it might be to do with sexism and money. But at the same time, I wanted to actually look into it and see if that was really the case.
Yeah, it's fascinating to sort of look at it from that perspective of the birth of cinema and where women were positioned in society. In the very birth of cinema, there were women involved massively. I mean, I always think about, because I'm an editor, I know about, some of the early editing was a craft that was mostly done by women. So what was it that happened? Yeah,
I actually wanted to write more about editors, and then they kind of I was well over the word count already, basically, so I had to lose some of the editing and composing sections. But yeah, there were women there right at the beginning. Like Alice Guy Blaché was directing movies in 1896, a couple of months after the Lumiere brothers first, projected. So it was an incredibly permissive time in that sense. And basically, I think what happened, and this is my take, and there are academics who have looked into this for their entire careers and who have more nuanced and more expert takes, but basically what I get from doing all the reading I've done is that when the big money came in, women were forced out. So women were trusted when it was a kind of cottage industry and anyone could pick up a camera and make a film. Women did so and made very good films, and those films made money, and therefore they were able to keep on doing it. But when it became an industry, it was sort of capital I industry, and big money started being invested from Wall Street, and big kind of corporations became big studios or took over big studios, then there was no place for women, because then it became to be seen as weird that you would have women in these very senior roles, and not just directing, but even writing. Women got pretty much squeezed out of writing. So in the 30s and 40s there were some female writers, but most of them were husband and wife writing teams and not solo female writers by the late 30s, 40s. So yeah, women just got kind of shoved aside, and it was perhaps inevitable, given that, at the time the film started, they didn't have the vote in most countries. So, maybe it must have seemed weird to investors that you would have women in positions of power. And it was becoming, again, when they started, the jobs weren't codified. So it wasn't clear that directing was an important role, that producing was an important role. It was just something that needed to be done. And as it became clear that those were important authoritative roles, then suddenly it was like, oh, well, why do we have women doing this? Ew, It's
bizarre, isn't it? It's so bizarre. And we've got to a point now where, if you say, by saying how difficult it is for women in the industry, people seem to think that invalidates that it's difficult for men as well. We're not saying it's difficult for men.
Absolutely.
We're just saying that, your gender hasn't got in the way.
Yeah. This is exactly it. I mean, of course, most men who would like to be film directors don't succeed in becoming film directors, of course. And of course, most women who want to be film directors don't succeed in becoming film directors. But the difference is the percentage of people who do, because we know that, like, in film school, it's been roughly 50% for quite some time now. And that is not reflected in the people who then get a chance to make films. And you see it if you actually look at the careers of women who make a film. Whether it does well or badly, it doesn't seem to matter. It still takes them longer to make their second film than it does their male counterparts, if they're lucky enough to make a second film. There have been studies that show it's about a decade between movies for most female directors historically. I think that's beginning to change. Whereas it's much less than that for men. You have the stories like Patty Jenkins gets Charlize Theron an Oscar nomination. Yeah. It is 13 years until her next film. 13 years. It's bizarre, Madness. Isn't it? It's almost like there's this sort of idea that there's only so much movie magic, and if we give it to the other 50%, maybe we won't get the magic. I think that's what it is. But I think there is that tendency for people to think that is somehow going to ruin the environment as well. Yeah, there's a few things going on there. There is absolutely the boys' club aspect, and the sense that women will come in and be kind of school marms and, clamp down on bad behaviour sometimes, and that what goes on set stays on set will cease to be the case. Right, yeah. I think, there is this that's a rather teenage attitude. That's the really sort of like very immature kind of, but I won't be able to have fun if there's a girl around and I'll have to watch my language, which, sorry, I was going to say it is a teenage attitude, but, I spoke to Madeline Most, who was a camera operator on the original Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, or assistant camera operator, and she worked with Gil Taylor, who was the famous cinematographer of Hard Day's Night and Doctor Strangelove, and then came in for Star Wars. And he said, what the fuck is a girl doing on this team? Who the fuck brought her in? It's going to ruin things. And she had to dress like, she told me, I had to dress like a boy. I had muscles and I had to prove my worth, and then she got the respect of the team. But it wasn't until I think Gil Taylor tried to get rid of her, and it was Marcia and George Lucas that said, no, we've seen her do her job, she's doing it well, she stays. Yeah. And it was only because they had that power that she did stay. But that's like camera, in the camera department, the objection traditionally was women can't do the heavy lifting, literally the heavy lifting, and therefore women can't rise through the ranks to the point where you no longer have to do the heavy lifting and, you're a cinematographer or whatever. And, that might have had some sway back in the early days. It definitely doesn't nowadays with digital. It just doesn't. That's not a thing. But that was happening in other departments too. That was happening in animation, where there is zero heavy lifting of any sort. Right, that's happening in composing, where there's zero heavy lifting of any sort. So it is. I think it's the attitude. It is this idea that women will stop us from having fun, and that is a bit like it. And it's coming from grown men. It's coming from adult humans, but it is a teenagey attitude. Like, the girls will spoil our fun. Yeah. Like, have different fun, guys. Just have different fun. That's it. The other thing that is happening now, and especially I've heard this directly about directors, is that white male directors who don't get jobs now are being told, oh, well, there was a quota, they had to give it to a woman. And like, with the greatest of respect, that is total bullshit, right? That is absolute. If you look at the numbers in the industry, there is no way that unqualified women are getting jobs. They're just not, because there are so few of them who are getting jobs right now. So those ones are tend to be more qualified than men who get jobs, right? And those men are being lied to, and they're believing it because it is convenient and it's kind of is, comforting to their egos. But it's incredibly toxic to tell them that. It really, really is. And it's not the case that a minority group or a woman or somebody else is stealing your job. You just didn't get the job this time. That happens. Deal with it. Everybody else has to deal with it. So that's really worrying, because that sets up this condition for a backlash, and it just, competing equally with other people is not being discriminated against. That's just what everybody else has had to do, while, essentially straight white men historically have been playing life on easy level. Yes. On the easy setting, I think Kelsey put it. I think it all comes down to the fear of mediocre men being found out. Yeah.
I think that's what it is.
And also, we will know that things are more equal when, mediocre women and mediocre black people or mediocre other people of color can also have careers in the same way that straight white mediocre men have been able to do. But the dream really is that the only people who succeed are the gifted people. That would be great, because then we'd all benefit as viewers. But I don't know if that's probably too much to hope.
As much as your book is, entertaining and informative, it's kind of infuriating as well, I have to say, from one point of view. And that point of view really is that the potential of the stuff we've missed over the years, I just think of all of the movies and how movie history could have been written entirely differently. And I think your book is a really good way for people to get a foot into that, that world and understand that there was a different history. A different history could have existed, but there was one that existed that isn't talked about as well. I mean, you talk about the inventor of the boom mic and stuff as well, which is fascinating.
Dorothy Arzner,
yeah.
But that's exactly the point, I think. It's not just that it's not fair to people, because I think, that argument goes so far, but you get a lot of people going like, who cares? Who cares if Barbra Streisand doesn't direct? She's still super rich and famous. Like, she's still doing okay. And it's like, okay, yes, but maybe she would have made great films, or somebody else would have made great films. Maybe Lena Horne did brilliantly and she had a great singing career. But if she had not been stymied by the racism in Hollywood at the time, maybe she would also have made your favorite film. And you never got to see it because she never got to make it. And so they're leaving half the potential, more than half the potential of films on the floor, and like commercially as well as kind of, artistically. They're leaving more than half their potential just locked out by only focusing on what one group wants to see. And that's the real tragedy to me. And it is infuriating, but it's also genuinely saddening, because I think we would have gotten some more great movies if certain people had been given the chance.
Mm. Even though I describe your book as infuriating at points, it is very optimistic as well, which I liked. And I also like that it isn't... I think there have been some stuffy books over the years about film history, and your book has the hardcore kind of history and women in film, but also we look at even something as light and fluffy as the Marvel and DC and Star Wars universes, because those are obviously important things right now. Have you had to deal with a bit of a backlash towards some of your film criticism from those... Oh, I hate to say it, those fandoms. I mean, I made films about Star Wars. I've interviewed a bunch of people about the Star Wars films, and I consider myself a fan of, well, at least 3 of those films.
Oh yeah,
but it's not like I'm part of a tribe, Have you had some the onslaught of those tribes?
I've had pretty much nothing but love from the Marvelites, who I think recognise that I am one of them. I do love those movies, genuinely, even while I do criticise the MCU for, its shortcomings. It took them, 21 films to get to a female lead. That's pretty terrible. I know why it happened. There was certain people behind the scenes who did not want it to happen before that. But still, 21 films, that is ridiculous. They got to the tree and the talking raccoon before they got to women. That's not a great look, guys, But I think true Marvel fans know that, so I don't think they're actually sort of defensive about it. I've had more grief historically, not about the book, but just historically from DC fans, because they are... I think at the moment they're a less happy bunch because their films have maybe not been quite so well received, and they feel put upon and hard done by in some cases. Not all DC fans, guys, not all, but
like you
but
say in the book, not all men. Get over it.
But yeah, there are some of them who I think feel somewhat, under siege by the world, and they have sometimes been dickish about it, frankly, on Twitter, and a little bit from Star Wars fans. But I think honestly, Rise of Skywalker is just not good, guys, and I think they kind of get that. So yeah, I haven't had that much backlash, but I do think that those fandoms are interesting and in some ways troubling, because there has been elements of racism and elements of misogyny that have fed into some of those great fandom battles in a way that is extremely troubling, and would be troubling to the creators and the characters of those those worlds, those universes.
Yeah.
So I do feel like there's a really awful phenomenon of a huge number of people missing the point of their own heroes, which is disappointing.
We've reached about the halfway point of my chat with author and film journalist Helen O'Hara. We'll be back after these short messages.
Are you tired of pop culture podcasts where the hosts exist in a constant, blissful state of agreement? Well, fear not. Let me introduce you to the Chinstroker versus Punter podcast. Mike is an ex-film student with a penchant for David Lynch, and Paul is your man on the street who likes what he knows and knows what he likes. Join us fortnightly as we discuss what we've been watching from our own very different perspectives. You can find us at csvsp.libsyn.com. Chinstroker versus Punter is a proud member of the Pod Syndicate family of podcasts.
Here's what some people are saying about the Projection Booth podcast.
The Projection Booth is single-handedly the greatest film podcast you could ever listen to or could possibly want.
Top notch. 5 stars. This has quickly become one of my favorite film-related podcasts. Always interesting.
A completely unpretentious yet fully comprehensive look at films from all genres.
The Projection Booth podcast, with new episodes available every week at projectionboothpodcast.com.
But then I look at some of the films that I grew up with and love, like the Indiana Jones films and the Star Wars films, and I watch them now, and there are some elements about them that I find difficult now. Sit down, sweetheart, we're taking off, you know. Then you've got Indiana Jones with, you know...
Temple of Doom, you know, there's some very troubling cultural depictions, let's just say.
Yeah, I mean, Indiana Jones is very much on the wrong side of history right now. I mean, goodness knows what they're going to do with the 5th one. And then you've got these people saying, oh, it's going to be a woke sequel. It's like, well, good. If it is, what's the problem with not being an arsehole?
So woke to me, the weaponizing of that word is outrageous. I mean, first of all, like it's a word meant to be used by black people about black issues. So first of all, like none of us should really be using it. But second of all, this idea that it's bad to be aware of your prejudice and try to do better, or that it's bad to include a diverse range of voices. I mean, as I've kind of said already, and as I say in the book, diverse voices they're good from an entertainment point of view and a commercial point of view, as well as a moral point of view. Leaving aside the moral question, we have seen every possible variation on the alcoholic white detective. We have male detective. We have seen every possible. We haven't seen that many female mother detectives, right? We haven't seen that many, I don't know, Muslim woman detectives. We just haven't. That's more interesting. That gives you a different story to tell. That gives you some way to surprise your audience and do something different, engage people in a new way. And you are stupid if you don't try to think about that.
Yeah.
You are genuinely stupid.
Yeah.
So it's not about wokeness, and it is a lie to pretend that it is.
Yeah, I kind of try and convince myself that it's a minority of people that are tweeting this stuff. And I hope it is. Because, you know, as somebody who grew up I've grown up and lived in Southeast London all my life. I mean, it doesn't get more diverse, really, around where I live. And yet, last night, we have only the second woman to win an Oscar and the second woman of colour to win the Best Picture, Oscar. It just boggles my mind that that's the case. You know, we all kind of reach for this Hollywood world, but actually, there isn't much to admire there, you know, in the history. Well, I mean, there are many things to admire, but it's also a lot of pretty grim stuff as well. I found out recently that I'm related to Joan and Constance Bennett, the famous actress, Hollywood actresses, and I was reading this morning about how Joan sent to a powerful Hollywood columnist, Hedda Hooper. It was like a gossip columnist.
Yeah, she was amazing.
Yeah, she sent her a descented skunk. As a gift, because she was writing some dirt on her and stuff, and that skunk then got donated or given to James and Pamela Mason as a companion for their cats.
Amazing.
But only after Hedda had named it Joan. But I was reading just how kind of a force of nature Joan and Constance were in the industry. You know, I think it was Constance that convinced Jack Warner not only to pay her salary, but to pay her income tax and her agent's fee on one of the films that she was working on. But ultimately, if you read further through her career. Ultimately, it was that kind of tenacity that ruined her career because people just kind of tired of it.
This is the case with so many women in the studio era, is that you had to be, pretty forthright to press your case and get yourself decent roles because you probably weren't being offered them. So you have the Joan Crawfords and Bette Davises who did that pretty much as standard. But equally, that made them enemies. So the moment that you do that and you have a flop, you're in serious difficulty. And that's the big gamble. Once you do that, you have no leeway for any kind of failure. And again, this is one of the recurrent themes in the book. As long as you were being really successful, you could get away with being a woman, you could get away with being black, you could get away with whatever. But the moment you have any hint of a flop, that's it. And you don't get the same opportunity for second chances. And yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. Again, think of what we missed.
Yeah. And as you said, those gaps between making films as well. I mean, even if they were a success, you're waiting a decade. If they're not a success, your chance is gone.
Forget about it, yeah.
Yeah. There are so many male directors that have had flops and massive flops that have just reappeared again suddenly.
Pretty much immediately in some cases. I mean, look, there are some men in movie jail. Frank Darabont hasn't made a film in far too long. But generally speaking, long-term residents of movie jail are mostly women, or certainly disproportionately women. If they make up less than 20% of directors, which they always do, I would say they're probably 50% of people sent to movie jail. It's mad.
I was talking to Peter MacDonald recently, who's he's like the most well-known second unit director. He worked on everything. Yeah, he ended up directing Rambo 3 because they sacked the director, but he did some of the Harry Potters and I think Tango and Cash in the 80s. He saw all the Hoth stuff in The Empire Strikes Back, and he was just saying about how many directors that have been thrown at him, all male directors, that didn't have a clue how to direct.
Yeah,
they just were thrust into this position for whatever reason. The powers that be just decided they were the right person to have, and then Peter would do all the work. I think he was telling me about one of his films. One of his colleagues counted the shots in it. I'm not going to say which film it was because I don't think he wanted me to mention it. But 82% of the shots were Peter's. And the rest were this new director who then didn't appear again for some years and then ended up doing another big movie. I mean, it just boggles the mind.
Yeah, you do hear some stories, don't you?
You do. I had a couple of questions from my Twitter followers. Warren York, who I know, his nickname is Waz. When watching a movie, he says, is it a different experience for you when it's one you'll be reviewing, and is it more difficult to fully engage? And also, do you take notes during cinema screenings?
So I try not to let it be different for a start. So I try to just watch the movie and I don't take notes usually. The only exception to that is where it's a big movie that I know I'm going to have to review in a short space of time. So the examples I always cite at this point are Star Wars Force Awakens and the last two Avengers movies. All of those I was reviewing, and I had, in the case of the two Avengers movies, I had effectively about 40 minutes of writing time to write about 800 words. So I did take copious notes in those cases. I didn't take my eyes off the screen. I was literally sprawling in my notebook. They are very close to unreadable, but just about close enough to readable for me. And yeah, I did take notes just because I kind of needed them as a crutch maybe, or a comfort, to be sure that I'd be able to kind of turn it around quickly enough. And I think I was lucky in all those cases that I had strong opinions on those films. The hardest thing is to write a film review of a film that you are just like kind of meh about. That's difficult. And so I was lucky that I loved the two Avengers and I very much liked Force Awakens because I thought it was a good way to kind of reset Star Wars, which I think is, yes, it's derivative and yes, it basically remixes the original trilogy, but maybe we needed that, I think, at that point. So I don't think it's Force Awakens' fault that everything went wrong later on. But yeah, so I had a point of view, I had a strong opinion. It was fine. I barely looked at my notes actually in the end, but it was good to have them there, and it helped me kind of get through those quite as quickly as I did. So yeah.
And how do you see your responsibility as a film journalist? Because I mentioned to you before we started recording that I see you as part of the film industry. You're not on the outside looking in, because if you review a film and if you highlight a particular film, that of course is going to maybe drive people to go to the cinema. That in turn will then increase the profit, and then maybe it will lead to more films of that kind being made in the future. Is that a kind of thing, a weight you carry on your shoulders?
I mean, look, I take my job seriously in the sense that I don't want to recommend something that I don't think is good, and vice versa, and I don't lightly criticize something, because I know that any film, hundreds of people have worked on it. And even if it's really bad, the chances are that many of those people did really good work. So I try not to make it personal. I try not to make it cruel, as far as possible. I really hate Joker, but I will acknowledge that, the cinematography is good and the score is fantastic. And even Joaquin Phoenix is good. I just hate the film with a passion. So I try, generally speaking, not to be kind of personal. And the other thing is, like, even if you're, if I am going to criticize someone, I try to make sure it's the director, because if the director is going to get the lion's share of the praise, then the director is going to get the lion's share of the blame. And I blame auteur theory for that.
Yeah.
But even then, in a lot of cases, especially with a young and upcoming director, we don't know. The studio boss may have taken that off them. That director might be heartbroken at the result of the film that they worked so hard on, and it may be completely contrary to what they intended to do. So I do try to have a bit of a responsibility not to be needlessly mean to filmmakers. That said, I will criticize a film if I think it deserves it, because I don't want people to go in kind of unguarded. So I take it seriously to that extent. I don't think about this job as being, shaping the industry itself. I think in aggregate, yes, reviewing has a role in doing that. And I think I've talked about that in the book, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to include criticism, because I think it's important. But I think that's like en masse. I don't think it's ever individual reviews that really do that.
I was going to say, there are some reviewers though that are that big that their audience is massive. Like, you think of someone like
Pauline Kael kind of.
Yeah, and or Dilys Powell, if she pulled apart a movie, that had big consequences. Yeah,
it did. But maybe I've never just felt that powerful. But I do think that it happens, yes, but I don't think it's generally one review. I think it's generally a consensus, especially in these days of Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. So I think reviewers have a role, but I don't think of us as being inside the industry, because we always feel like we're scrabbling at the door for screenings and everything else. So it never really feels like we're an integral part of it, even though I acknowledge that, yes, there are ties there and there are, links that maybe, everybody else doesn't have. So it's kind of an odd role. Especially if, like us, we're not pure reviewers. We also do interviews and things like that. So we do meet some of these people. You always try not to review the films of people, things you've been on set of, for example, because that would kind of feel like crossing the streams a bit too much. Yeah. But we do at least, we may have met some of the people involved in many films once you've been doing this for a while. So you have to kind of be able to kind of separate the two. Yeah. But that's another reason just not to make it personal. And again, I think the kind of reviewers who delight in tearing stuff apart, who delight in cynicism, who delight in almost bitterness when a film isn't good. I feel like that's a bit teenage and just a bit immature. I'm always a bit like, get over yourself a little bit. Like, I'm not saying don't be negative. Obviously, there are bad films out there and they should absolutely be described as such. But when they really take, actual delight in going to town on something, it always feels a little, a bit sad, really, to me. Yeah, it's all a bit unnecessary, isn't it? Yeah. You mentioned the auteur theory in there as well, and that's an important part of this whole way that the filmmaking process is perceived, because if anything, film is one of the most collaborative art forms that we know exists, and we acknowledge that because you even look at something like the Oscars last night, where you get awards for editing and sound editing and screenwriting and whatever else, yet somehow we fixate on these kind of male godlike characters. And do you think that has had a big influence on how and why women have not managed to
sort of get back into the industry.
Yeah, honestly, yes. So and this is something I kind of, again, tried to grapple with in the book, because I realize that there are subtleties to it. And I realize that the auteur theory as it is used and as it is intended are very different things. So, I've tried to kind of acknowledge that. But the way it is used is very much as a bludgeon, I think. And it does diminish the credit that goes to hundreds sometimes of people who are involved in a film. But it also, because it is such a coveted designation, it is something that has been awarded very sparingly to women. And it is very much, I think it's exacerbated this tendency not to give directing jobs to women. I think it has exacerbated that. So even as the sort of 70s went on and you got more women in production, senior roles in production and senior studio roles, the auteur theory was also growing at the same time. And so there wasn't any comparable real change in who was getting the directing jobs. And I do think it plays a role. But maybe it plays a role because it ties into existing prejudices. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, But yeah, until everybody is kind of equally likely to be called an auteur, I do think we should be very careful of it, because I think there is a tendency not to credit women the same way as men as directors. And it is partly maybe a matter of style as well, because I think, and again, not all men, but I think there is a tendency by some men not to go out of their way to thank collaborators, right? And not to go out of their way to acknowledge the role that other people have played in their success. And I think women who are like that don't get to that level because everybody hates them. And therefore, they do not have the opportunity to thank their collaborators or anybody else. So you get these women who get to the top and they are opinionated and they are bullish and they are, they probably have been described as a bitch by somebody at some point, just by the very nature of a director having to make decisions. There are probably people who hate them, but they are also people who understand the value of collaboration and who are also willing to acknowledge others who have helped them for the most part. And so I think you can be ruder as a man and get away with it, and I don't think you can as a woman, and therefore that is then sometimes weaponized back against women so that they are not credited with the full talent in the same way that a man would be.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Yeah, totally. And I think immediately of two particular film stars who we know there are recordings of absolutely ranting on set, and yet they're just seen as passionate,
Passionate, exactly. And this is the big difference. A man, those men are not described as emotional. They're described as passionate.
Yeah, it's true.
They're not described as wrecks that you should avoid working with. They're not described as divas, even though they are. But women acting the same way, I mean, come on,
Yeah.
And especially for directors. And this is something I tried to touch on a bit, but the famous Catherine Hardwicke example of, basically just having a cry for a minute one day because everything was just a lot. And then she comes back to the set and she does her job and everything was on budget and everything was on schedule. Nobody got fired, and yet she's emotional. I have real trouble with this. David O. Russell doesn't get described as emotional and people keep working with him.
Yeah.
At least until recently, maybe. So, it is an absolutely clear double standard. There is a very, very, very big divide in the way that men are allowed to act and the way that women are allowed to act. And that's not, again, this is not just in film. This is in all of public life and probably private life as well. I think there is a tendency to default, again, not all men, but there's a tendency to default to describing women as crazy, emotional, somehow out of control. And, men literally pick up guns and go into shopping malls and shoot people.
Yeah.
And they're described as, having had a bad day. What? Seriously? And this is obviously on a lower level, but this happens every single day. You get men telling women that they're crazy for basically demanding to be listened to for a second. And again, these are statistics I quote in the book, but men perceive a conversation as being dominated by women if women talk 30% of the time. Wow. They think women are talking too much. So when men tell you that women talk too much, they're lying. They're, like, scientifically speaking, lying. But, this is still what we get. So, yeah, it's there's a lot to unpack. It's not just Hollywood. I do realize that, but it has these very deleterious effects on the kind of films that we get to see.
Yeah, I agree absolutely. And you say it really nicely in the book about, the stories we tell reflect what we value, who we empathise with, and how we see the world. From a very basic, I remember the first time I saw Superman, I wanted to be Superman because I was a boy, he was a boy. I could put a cape in my neck and run around my grandparents' house pretending to fly. But there was nothing for my sister to kind of connect with in those films. And
I mean, I played Leia in the playground. But if there was another girl in the group who was already playing Leia, then I had no role to play in our playground game. It literally was that stark.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's exactly it. I didn't have other role models really at that point.
Yeah. And this links nicely in a radio segue kind of way to my last question for you. My 13-year-old daughter, Olivia, saw me reading the book and she said, "Oh, what's that about?" And I was just telling her. And she said, "Oh, does she recommend any good movies for teenage girls?" She's 13. Ooh. She said, "There aren't any movies about me." And I wondered if I'm putting you on the spot now.
Yeah, well, I don't know what I can... So, 8th grade is literally about her, but I think actually, because it has some bad language in it, I think it's rated 15.
Well, maybe we could stretch to that.
I think you could maybe stretch, but you can have a look yourself. I believe it's on either Prime or Netflix at the moment. But yeah, I think this has been a massive, massive problem because I do think especially teenage girls are really, really badly served by movies. And I think things that teenage girls love are automatically dismissed by quote unquote serious critics as being automatically foolish and frivolous and meaningless. And it genuinely makes me quite cross. So I do think, first of all, that she is right and she is underserved and there are not enough movies for her. A lot of the ones I want to recommend are probably a little bit older. So stuff like Booksmart.
I have a 16-year-old as well. So
oh my God.
Nearly 16.
I mean,
yeah,
that is I was actually angry watching that film that I wasn't with my best friend from school at the time because I was just like, I really want to watch this and nudge you throughout going, that's us. Oh my God. Because it felt so authentic. Obviously the great classics, Mean Girls, Clueless, are fantastic.
Yeah, I don't know if they've seen those actually. I should, yeah. Clueless is great. I remember.
Clueless is incredible. Mean Girls, I think, is still just fantastic. 10 Things I Hate About You, also great. Also one of the great ones. Oh gosh, I'm blanking now. Do you know what I watched the other night? And it's aimed at much younger kids, but it's very cute. Dora the Explorer.
The most recent one?
Yeah.
The live action
one? It's
one?
really cute,
Is
honestly.
It? Right.
Yeah.
I did hear some good things about that at the time, but yeah, I think they were at that stage, because that was a couple of years ago now, right? So it
is, yeah.
They would have been 11 and 13, and they're like, what?
I mean, it won't be cool. You should make it clear. I know they're too old for it, but also she is 18 in it, so it's not completely out of range. And yeah, it's very cute. I did like that. And obviously, what else? Because
I've shown them a lot of the, they grew up watching the Ghibli films like Kiki's
amazing.
Delivery Service and My Neighbor Totoro and Ponyo and things like that.
Yeah. Howl's Moving Castle.
Howl's Moving Castle is a big one, yeah, for us. But yeah, okay, well that's a pretty good list there to be going on with. And I'll be sending that to her tonight because we try.
And Edge of 17 as well. Edge of 17.
Edge of 17.
I knew there was another one.
I didn't see that. I'm writing this down.
That's the Haley Steinfeld one. I think it's on Netflix at the moment. I think.
Cool. Helen, thanks so much for coming on, and I really recommend the book to my listeners who are probably like me, mid-40s white guys, so they could do with it. So Women versus Hollywood, The Fall and Rise of Women in Film by Helen O'Hara. Yeah, it's a really good book, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
All right,
lovely.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat there with Helen. I certainly did. She was really nice to talk to. We had a bit of a natter afterwards as well. And I think she's just got a very healthy perspective on all of this stuff that we were talking about, with an optimism as well that it can change and it will change. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing more films from, some of my favourite female directors, Greta Gerwig and Catherine Bigelow and Patty Jenkins and Andrea Arnold. Andrea Arnold's an interesting one because we grew up in the same town, and she grew up on the same crappy estate that my parents grew up on, and she made that film Wasp, the short film that won the Oscar, and then of course went on to make American Honey. Looking forward to seeing what she does next. For the upcoming episodes of the Filmumentaries podcast, I've got an interview I just did the weekend, actually, here at the end of April 2021, with a guy called John Lefkowitz. He made a documentary about Walter Murch, who's a figure I found fascinating for many years. That was a really nice interview, actually. We both kind of are a bit in love with Walter's work and his kind of philosophies and his persona, so that was a fun one. I also spoke that same day to Jim Maxwell, who is art director and map painter, digital map painter. Again, really good fun interview. We got to kind of talk about his experiences at Industrial Light and Magic, and, you know, rubbing elbows with some of those big names that have cropped up a few times in the 24 episodes of my podcast. So one of those I will pick to release as the second episode of May 2021. I'm also going to put a bonus episode in there that I won't charge my patrons for, I think, if I have the time. I do have a busy month ahead of my regular work, but I'll endeavour to do that. I've also just heard from Dan Perry. Now, if that's a name you don't recognise, you'll certainly recognise his work. He's worked on some of the most iconic title sequences in film history, including The King of Comedy, The Warriors, New York, New York, Star Wars, The Exorcist, All the President's Men. As I've said before on the podcast, you know, doing this is a hobby really for me, but it's also an education. So I'm really excited to talk to Dan about his particular craft, because it's something I don't know much about. I hope you enjoy that one too. That'll be coming up soon. I've also got Gary Rydstrom coming as well, sound designer, Oscar winner. We've set a date now. That's going to be early May 2021, the recording, so I'll probably get that out in June. Still speaking to Colin Goody about getting a date fixed as well. Hopefully we can do that soon. And I've got Roger Christian coming up soon as well, hopefully talking about his work on both Star Wars and Alien. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention was I've been doing a couple of competitions on Twitter. So by retweeting my pinned post a couple of times now, you've had the chance of winning some film goodies. So for the first competition, the prize was a retro Boba Fett action figure, and I chucked in a few little bits of Filmumentaries paraphernalia as well. And then the most recent one I did was to win Alan Arnold's Making of the Empire Strikes Back book, which, looking on eBay, is worth about 60 to 150 quid right now. So the winner of that will be very pleased, hopefully. So I'll be sending that out today to John Rhodes. So by the time you hear this, John, hopefully you'll have the copy in your hands. It's a great book, and I recommend it to anybody. It's The Journal of the Making of the Empire Strikes Back by Alan Arnold. So do keep an eye on Twitter. I'm on @JamieSWB because I'll be running a few more competitions in the coming weeks when episodes of the podcast get released. Oh, before we go, a big thank you to my new patrons as well on Patreon. I've now got 50 people on Patreon, which is fantastic. I never thought I'd have 50 listeners, let alone 50 people that want to help me do this. So thanks so much to all of you that continue to support me. If you'd like to do so, you can do that by going to patreon.com/Jamie Benning, and you can donate as little as $1 per creation or $1 per month. You can put a monthly cap on it. Generally, I'll release 2 things a month, sometimes 3 things, but I'm not here to empty your bank balance. But I do appreciate your support, but it's always gratefully received and very humbling. In the meantime, thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.